All right, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. We thank you so much for joining us today on this webinar on the Spotlight on East Africa. We're delighted that you've made time to be with us for the next hour and a half as we look at the business opportunities in East Africa for investors who are looking to do business in this region and how they can mitigate some of the risks that may present themselves when they're doing business. Now, today we have our speakers, 4 esteemed speakers. They're all partners or directors in the firm and leading lights in their respective areas of specialization. So I'll just do a quick introduction of our 4 panelists today, who will be taking us through Spotlight in East Africa. And then we'll just do some quick house rules before we start. Once again, thank you very much for making the time to be with us today, and we're delighted to have you here with us. Our speakers today, we have Njeri, we also have Megan, Jacquel, and Desmond. So those are the 4 panelists that we have today. Njeri is a partner in Cliffdecker Hofmeyr. She's a partner and a specialist in mergers and acquisition, private equity, and employment. She's dual qualified in Kenya and in England. And she also is a multilingual speaker, speaking up to 5 languages, and including French and English. She also hosts a popular talk show called Njeri Talks, which you could look up and see and learn more. We also have Megan. Megan is a director and sector head of the oil and gas practice at Cliffdecker Hofmeyr. She holds an LLM degree and LLM degree cum laude from the University of Western Cape, and she is currently an MBA student at the International Oil and Gas Management at the University of Dundee. She is also a member of AIPN and serves on the AIPN drilling contract subcommittee. She's assisted many clients with upstream oil and gas projects in more than 13 countries across 4 continents, and she works closely with independent oil companies, national oil companies, service providers in this sector, as well as regulatory authorities. She's part of the team that was awarded the 2010 Oil and Gas Deal of the Year Award and the 2014 Oil and Gas Legal Advisor of the Year Award by the African Investor, and was recently named an IFLR 1000 women leader. We also have Jacquel. Jacquel is also a director at CDH. He's a first sector head of CDH's brand new sector focused on industrials, manufacturing, and trade. This new sector brings together experts from various disciplines within CDH to help clients navigate opportunities in continental agreements such as AfCFTA. And also, Jacquel is an experienced attorney providing dispute resolution both domestically, inter-Africa, and internationally. He advises on risk and regulatory matters to clients within East Africa and looking at value chains in oil and gas, mining, energy and natural resources, acting for both private sector and also state-owned entities. Lastly, but not least, we also have Desmond. Desmond is a partner. He's a partner in the dispute resolution department of the firm. He's also an expert in business rescue, restructuring, and insolvency. He's also a qualified mediator and member of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators. All right, so just some quick house rules before we start. So we'll have like a round robin where each and every one of our panelists will have about 10 minutes to present, and 10-15 minutes of presentation, and then we'll have questions after each speaker. Please do put your questions in the Q&A as you go along, and we will have this answered by the different panelists. We'll try and answer all the questions that we get, and in the event we don't reach your question, we reassure you that we will get back to you on email addressing that question. All right, so let's start off with Njeri. Njeri, as you start looking at Spotlight on East Africa, and we are interested to know, what are the sort of opportunities that you're seeing within East Africa? What are the trends that you're anticipating from an M&A perspective within the East African region? And how can investors position themselves to make the most of these opportunities? Over to you, Njeri.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for allowing us to have this webinar and allowing us to speak. It's my pleasure to be here, and thank you so much, Sami, for that very warm introduction. So we're talking about M&A and M&A activities in East Africa. What we want to know is where we are, where we're going, and what is going to happen in the future, and what we can predict, and how we can best protect ourselves as business people, and in order to prepare for the future. Yeah. So let's go. So traditionally, in the recent past, the deals have been in M&A in the traditional banking sector, telecommunications, mining, insurance, manufacturing, and retail. But because we have been influenced by foreign direct investment from the US and the UK, we have also been susceptible to what has happened in those particular jurisdictions. And so the US political landscape, the UK's decision to leave the European Union, and general, political instability and economic instability have meant that all of these traditional M&A hotspots have been affected and have been susceptible to change. So M&A activity has been in decline, and it has not been helped that COVID-19 has then come in to make the situation that much worse for M&A and those type of activities in the region. So we've looked at what the predictions are, and actually it's slightly better than what we thought. The IMF had predicted a decline to 0.8% growth GDP, but this has now been slightly improved to 3.5% globally, and we take a very marginal in the East African space stake in that growth, but it's not all in vain. It means that there's hope, and the predictions are that in the next 18 to 24 months there'll be an increase in deal transactions and deal values, and we will look at why that will be and how that will come about later on in this presentation. But really, the sectors that have been affected largely are tourism. It's expected because of COVID. Logistics between East African countries has been affected, and retail has been affected. So we're seeing a sharp decline in those areas, and they've suffered the most due to COVID and the economic instability that I referred to earlier. Yeah. So we can now move on to the next. The opportunities that there are in East Africa are largely the ones that I've identified here: fintech, energy, and petroleum. Whereas before, if we look at Kenya, for example, the banking industry has been a large part of M&A activity as people look to consolidate and bring together banks, which has been the CBK's policy in any case. Now we're looking at fintech and financial services in the provision of either digital lending or M-Pesa loans or that kind of thing. So the banking sector is changing more towards digital banking, and fintech is going to help that a lot. Yeah. If we look at, oh, sorry, Karishka, we're not done. We're not done there. If we look at the deals that have been done in the banking sector, therefore, we're looking at KCB and Atlas Mara in Kenya, Equity Bank in Congo. We're looking in Tanzania, mergers of TPP banking. We're looking in Uganda at the acquisition of Opportunity Bank, was acquired by MyBucks Group. All of those are either investments that are going to move the traditional banking into fintech type banking, and so digitalize the market and revolutionize it that way. And those changes we will see across the board. We also now need to look at, if we're looking at those opportunities, then what happens, how is regulation helping, and what are the stimuluses that will then give people encouragement in order for them, or businesses to encourage them to go into those sectors. And that is going to be led by government legislation, regulation, deregulation in some cases, or creating a conducive environment for fintech to grow. In Kenya specifically, there's been a lot of discussion about digital lending, and the CBK has come up with an amendment bill that will see either, it's still at the discussion stage, but it will see either the growth or the encouragement of fintech type mergers or acquisitions, or even PE funds to come into the market, or will lead to a decrease, unfortunately, a decrease in the interest in fintech in this region, which is different from West Africa, where there isn't that level of regulation. So Nigeria has seen a lot of fintech and an increase in fintech in its own portfolios, etc. So we need to make ourselves as attractive as possible as East Africa for the future and prepare for that. I want to talk a bit about the energy and petroleum. Obviously, that has always been a traditional M&A hotspot of activity. Kenya with the tallow, which and the discovery of oil, that had huge potential. Now much less, but other countries in East Africa are coming up, Tanzania specifically in that region, especially in mining. I also want to talk about the blue economy. Now, the blue economy is a new concept, and it's the idea of really using ocean or marine resources sustainably in order to promote growth. There is an idea that this may be forthcoming in the future, and so there may be opportunities there, especially in Kenya and Tanzania, where we're at the coast, right? Maybe less Uganda and Rwanda and Burundi. Again, just to focus on other growing areas and other areas to look out for people who are interested. Ed tech, and that means educational technology, is also a hotspot because of the fact that people are working from home. The traditional schooling model may change due to COVID. People are less are more focused on the type of education and not where the education is being held, and so that may be of interest to people. And also state-owned, the acquisition of state-owned enterprises may be of interest to PE funds, specifically as governments look to raise funds as a result of COVID and the depleted economies that they've been facing over the period of the last 3 years. So state-owned enterprises, state-owned assets may be of interest, and the acquisition of those assets may be of interest in the future. So there are opportunities there. Yeah. We can go to the next slide.
Yeah, and Jerry, as the next slide comes through,
yes.
You mentioned a number of M&A transactions that have taken place within the East African market, and
yeah.
I don't know what your view is. Is it suggesting that the markets within the respective countries are saturated and they're looking for opportunities elsewhere, or is it pointing that we're having a more regional, a better interaction between countries in East Africa?
It's a mix of the two. So, for example, if you look at Burundi is mainly telecoms, and their biggest M&A transaction was the merger of Econet Wireless in Burundi and Ucom Leo, which merged. And their telecoms industry is the main one, and that's the focus of where M&A activity has been. For Kenya and Tanzania and Uganda, which are slightly more advanced, and even Rwanda to a certain extent, it's about bringing together regional capabilities. So Equity Bank, for example, going into Congo, is really bringing together their already existing capabilities in Kenya, Tanzania, and Uganda, and saying let's build a regional value chain. And then what we're seeing with the banking and traditional banking and transactions is just the consolidation of already existing banks in those regions. What we want to see now is really an increase in regional value chain building through the acquisition of assets in Tanzania and a company in Kenya and a retail business in Uganda to really promote regional value within different sectors and not relying on traditional sectors that have been existing. That would be where ideally we would like to see the market go. Does that make sense, Sammy?
Yes, it does. And I mean, you mentioned, it's good to see that regional value chain. And I'm just wondering, what are the bottlenecks you anticipate or that you've experienced when you're looking at different M&A activity in this region?
Okay, so I think this is the crux of it, and really the key question for us, because traditionally, foreign investors or PE funds have come into the market and not been willing to take a risk on assets that they're not clear about, companies that they've not diligenced to the hills, or even industries that they are not comfortable in knowing about or have known about from the US or Europe, etc. And what really we need to do is be able to rely on ourselves and rely on African PE funds and African investors really making investments in their own continent. Yeah, and so the over-reliance on PE funds or European and US PE funds or foreign investment has meant that we are then susceptible to the changes that they are themselves facing instead of relying on our own capabilities. And that's really what we would like to see. For those investors who have come into the country or into the region, where they have encountered bottlenecks have been in the failure to carry out correct due diligence or been overly reliant on statistics that are applicable perhaps in Europe and in the US, but may not be applicable in this country or in the region. So one example I can give you is a school, a group of schools that was being acquired by a foreign PE fund, and they were relying on the numbers of pupils and class attendance as one measure of potential growth in that sector or in the school or in the group of schools. And really what they needed to look at because of COVID was not that, it was actually going to be the number of registrations in the school and the school fees and how you could grow that school fees over time rather than just numbers. And so looking really at the knowing the industry that you're entering into, understanding how it works, and then understanding the local nuances that may not be existing where you have perhaps come from. Other things that will be bottlenecks will be understanding the political and legal landscape. For Kenya, that will definitely be the elections that are coming up next year. What does that mean for us? What does it mean for the region? Because Kenya is, ahead of economy-wise of all of the other countries within the region. And then really for East Africa to then create its own ability to be self-reliant so that there is no susceptibility. If Tanzania has elections, it doesn't have an impact on a Kenyan business. If Uganda has political instability, it doesn't mean that Rwanda is now unable to move. And that will come with, as we move on to the next slide, it will come with, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, and really the ability for us to remove those barriers freedom of movement of the people, freedom of trade in goods, the removal of export and import taxes within the group will mean that we're looking inward instead of outward, and will mean that not only do we create regional value chains, but we also create chains within Africa itself, which will then no doubt encourage investment, encourage M&A activity, even from West Africa to East Africa, North Africa to South Africa, and build exactly what we are building ourselves at CDH, which is a regional and Africa-wide law firm and a service provider that can understand both the West and East, and Africa becomes a real continent for itself rather than relying on its European and Western partners. So that's the end of my presentation. I don't know, Sammy, if you have any questions for me.
Yeah, thank you, Jerry. That was clear. Please, just a reminder to everybody who's attending, feel free and do send your questions through in the Q&A section. I would love to hear from you and to address some of the concerns or even just receive comments on what we're discussing today. But thank you very much, Jerry. I think financial services seems to still be the key area of focus for a lot of investment, and perennially has been the case, but you've also highlighted some interesting areas that investors would be interested to know about around EdTech, potentially privatizations as governments look to fundraise and probably, let go of certain poorly performing institutions, state-owned corporations, and also a reminder that we must invest in ourselves, and that will allow us to grow sustainably rather than waiting for foreign investment to come through.
Yeah, thank you very much. You've summarized it well, Sammy.
All right, fantastic. So please do send your questions through in the Q&A. Would love to hear from you. So now we are moving to the next panelist, Megan. What prospects are you seeing for investors in the oil and gas sector? In East Africa, we've seen a lot of start and stop exploration, getting excited when we find potential petroleum resources. There has been talk and developments of pipelines and, the powder keg of COVID, unpredictable prices. So what do you anticipate? What should investors be aware of? What is the oil and gas outlook, Megan?
Thank you, Sammy. Good afternoon to all of the participants on the webinar today. And again, a very warm welcome from me to this webinar. So as Sammy has summarized, the presentation I'll be sharing with you today really focuses on the oil and gas outlook, business opportunities, particularly within the East Africa community. And we'll also look a little bit at the impact of the African Continental Trade Agreement, Free Trade Area Agreement within the oil and gas space, and what the benefits of implementation of the free trade African Free Trade Area will be for the oil and gas sector. So let's start off by answering your very first question, Sammy, on what's been happening globally in the sector in terms of pricing and the impact of COVID. What we saw over the period 2020, starting from the very first quarter, was a combination of a COVID impact coupled with an OPEC price war impact. Just as the OPEC price war was dissipating, we found ourselves in the midst of a COVID-19 pandemic as the oil and gas industry, which automatically resulted in a decline in consumption of the oil and gas commodity. And this, of course, has an automatic impact on prices. So by March 2020, Brent crude oil prices had dropped by approximately 30%. So we found the oil price hovering between $26 and $29 per barrel. And this really sent shockwaves through the financial markets at the time. And then subsequent to that, a further shockwave was caused by WTI, price oil futures turning negative for the very first time in history. Simply put, producers were paying traders to take oil because there was simply no place to store it. And this was a combination of the fact that the industrialized economy had essentially shut down for lockdowns during the COVID period. Despite the economic shutdowns, the oil price actually rebounded quite quickly, as it usually does. Once the economies open up, countries come out of lockdowns, usage and consumption increases. So we saw a very rapid response to COVID in the sector when essentially everybody came back online and economies opened. By May 2020, China, the first country in lockdown and the first one technically out of lockdown, in record-breaking fashion in one haul, ordered crude oil petroleum to the value of 35.2 million barrels. So that was a significant rebound and a significant kickstart to the industry by May 2020. Then late in the year, the fourth quarter of 2020, we saw the other economies opening, countries coming out of lockdown, shipping, international shipping and transportation commencing. We currently have Brent hovering at around $70 a barrel, and WTI at 69, between 69 and 70, and of course gas at $3.10. So the industry has rebounded quite quickly from the COVID impact, the initial COVID impact of 2020, and it is steadying in terms of price. Ultimately, one must remember that the oil and gas sector is a resilient sector. The reliance on the commodity hasn't dissipated since the 19th century, when oil production really started and fueled sort of industrialization. We can move on to the next slide. The other event which arose and has transformed the oil sector and oil businesses in particular to a certain extent during 2020 was the drive for decarbonization. And this was really twofold. Number one, coming out of COVID lockdowns, or at least the COVID lockdowns, resulted in a 17% temporary drop in CO2 emissions. So this fueled the decarbonization drive. Combined with the Paris Agreement requirements on countries to submit in 2020 their plans to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions in order to reach the 2050 targets in the Paris Agreement, of which East Africa Community is a party. So what we saw happen in the oil and gas sector and what this meant for oil and gas businesses, and perhaps what's important to note from an investor perspective, is that many oil and gas companies have essentially diversified their portfolio. They've done this in one of two ways. They've either sought to increase renewable energy capacity or create new renewable energy capacity in the traditional sense of solar, wind, with long, medium and short-term goals. And then there are oil companies with strategies around reducing their emissions within their operations. I think what's important to note in this transition that we find ourselves in as the, globally speaking, the oil and gas business sector, is that the reliance on fossil fuels is not it. Renewable energy strategies, which we're seeing, coming through the businesses, the oil and gas businesses at the moment, are in addition to its fossil fuel businesses. The fossil fuel business still drives cash flows and essentially underpins and allows the diversification into the renewable energy space. So it's a combination, it's a mix of energy, different forms of energy which oil companies are looking to offer to their customer groups, whether it's oil and gas, fossil fuels, or within the renewable energy space. So that's quite an important trend to keep an eye on as an investor within either the energy space, renewable energy space, or the oil and gas business space. As the oil companies move towards and countries move towards those 2050 targets, we'll see a lot of movement not only the M&A landscape, but also the project development landscape within oil and gas businesses itself. It's quite an interesting and exciting period for oil and gas businesses, this decarbonization drive at the moment.
Yeah, and for decarbonization, Megan, if I could ask, there are different models that are being applied by traditional companies relative to their commitments. Could you please explain a bit more what that looks like?
Mm. So what we're seeing at the moment, Sammy, is really those two key strategies where all companies are either creating new capacity through renewable energy, or they are increasing capacity, or they're looking at the reducing emissions within existing operations. So it's really one of two legs: creating new capacity or expanding on existing capacity, or moving into reducing emissions in the existing oil and gas operations. So companies like, for example, and companies have publicly announced the individual decarbonization strategies. So what we see is companies like BP and companies like Eni are essentially looking at, BP is looking at developing a renewable energy capacity with a steep upward trajectory in a short uptake on that development. Their aim is to develop 20 gigawatts of renewable energy, and then to move them. They're starting from a base of around 3.3 gigawatts, and it's an accelerated program. But this is about accelerating the existing, renewable energy projects that they have underway. And then Eni have a much more progressive movement towards installed renewable energy capacity and increasing that output. Then we have companies like Shell, who have focused on reducing emissions within their current operations. So that's really the trends that we're seeing, and the types of implementations, the diverse forms of implementation of these renewable energy projects, which all companies are undertaking.
All right. Yeah, and also looking at, I think also Jerry mentioned the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. How is this likely to impact oil and gas projects? Will it have any impact on the delays that we normally see from regulators? What do you anticipate?
Yes, that's really the heart of a very important question, and the heart of the discussion today. Certainly from my perspective, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is essentially proposing to consolidate and eliminate barriers for investment from a regional perspective, and obviously encourage regional trade as a result. So from an investor perspective, particularly a foreign oil and gas company investor perspective, and getting a project moving from sort of early stage exploration into development and FID, where significant capital investment is required, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area will allow oil and gas investors to open up to a much larger market than just a national market. They can look at commercializing these projects regionally, from a regional perspective, from an Africa perspective. And that in itself is an incentive to drive the implementation of the free trade areas as quickly as possible, and achieve implementation as expeditiously as possible. Certainly from a government perspective, where there's a significant need for indigenization of these resources, utilization of these resources domestically as opposed to exports, it does create a significant opportunity to sort of what I call get the deal right, so that we indigenize the resource from a government perspective, and we remove the barriers, not only from an investment perspective, but also from a regulatory perspective for for investors. It streamlines the process for investment, or it proposes to streamline the process for investment. So that does bring me to the next slide, where we speak about utilization of the resources, comparative utilization of oil and gas resources comparative to what we import and what we export. So our proven reserves on the continent at 2020 is 227 TCF of gas, and that's a significant resource. Proven oil reserves is 125.7 billion barrels, also a significant resource. What we find on the oil front is that we consume as much as what we export. On the gas front, we consume more from an Africa perspective, and we export less. So the gas exports, the gas products consumed within Africa, 63% versus 37%. So we have quite a good ratio on our oil consumption and our oil exports, and an even better consumption in terms of gas consumption within the jurisdiction. But we still have limited refining capacity within Africa. We import approximately 48% of finished product. That's the product that is generated from crude oil. So our petroleum products are essentially imports are at 48%, which is significantly high for a jurisdiction with such a significant reserve. So an increase in our refining capacity, the number indicates that an increase in our refining capacity is definitely needed. And then if one also looks to, the telltale signs of underlying utilization of the resource, one only needs to look to my country, South Africa, to see that we suffer from rolling blackouts. In some jurisdictions, the World Bank records that in some African countries, the annual outages ranges from 50 to 4,600 hours annually. Now, if you think about the fact that there are about 8,760 hours in a year, there are some countries which only have electricity for half of the year. Those are significant numbers, and those are indicators that utilization of the resource has not been optimized within the jurisdiction or regionally. So what does the Continental Free Trade Area provide for us? How will it help us to better utilize the resource, then becomes the question. Well, it does in one of three ways. Next slide, please. The first is to facilitate foreign investment. In other words, what deal are we offering to foreign investors, and how will the Africa Free Trade Area Continental Free Trade Area allow us to better the deal to investors? Well, we'll be offering a single market. Essentially, the reduction of barriers by offering a regional market to investors is quite important to getting projects beyond, the exploratory phase, finding the resource, moving it into development. If we offer a regional market as opposed to a national market, which governments will be able to offer to investors if they implement the Africa Continental Free Trade correctly area. The second area, which will be the area of focus, or is an important area of focus for the proper utilization of the resource, is domestication, as I mentioned. So through the intra-Africa trade markets, which will be developed, we'll find domestication of the oil and gas resource happen as an almost necessary and following impact. Development of infrastructure such as refineries, GTL plants, investors would more readily back such investment if they know that they have off-takers that can consume the product regionally speaking and not limited to one market. So domesticating of the resource will be an automatic consequence of facilitating foreign investment into regional development. The socio-economic benefits, which then also results from domestication of the resource, through job creation, through value-added projects, through socio-economic development, and also through being cognizant of the fact that oil companies have also diversified their businesses to beyond oil and gas production, but to include, most oil companies have diversified into being a more energy-focused company. So the projects that will come will sort of piggy off the oil and gas projects are development potentially within the renewable energy space in order to add to that creation of capacity, or add to those 2050 goals which oil companies have really set for themselves in their business strategy. So there's a knock-on effect through the ability to facilitate foreign investors through developing a free trade, essentially regional approach to the resource. Next slide. Then focusing specifically on some of the projects which in my view will benefit from free trade areas. If one looks to East Africa, the Tanzania LNG project, the East Africa crude oil export pipeline, Kenya and Tanzania gas export pipeline, these are all regional projects by their definitions. With the Tanzania LNG project, two of the key elements which government and the partners are currently working on getting together is the cost competitive development options, as well as the establishment of a commercial framework for this. So what we anticipate will happen as a result of the free trade agreement is it will facilitate and add to the value proposition of projects like this. It will remove the cross-border regulatory issues and provide a seamless commercial package to a project like, in particular, the Tanzania LNG project, and that's really key. That's ultimately what we need to achieve, particularly looking at large-scale infrastructure projects which are cross-border. Similar with the East Africa crude oil export pipeline and the Kenya and Tanzania gas export pipeline. So the East Africa crude oil pipeline is probably a lot more advanced in development than the gas export pipeline project. But what the project, and we have a little diagram, a little map over here showing the route of the pipeline. So what this project will do is the crude oil pipeline will connect to oil fields around Lake Albert in Uganda, all the way through to the Tanzania export terminal. And what we anticipate is that the implementation of the free trade area will ultimately promote the interregional trading, job creation market in both Uganda and Tanzania. With reduced, and it will result in reduced reliance on imports for the countries which have access to and will be off-takers to that pipeline. So FID is still to be taken on this project, and this is once again, where we see delays in FID because commercialization and large-scale infrastructure development requires a collaborative approach between governments who will benefit from this pipeline. So the African Continental Free Trade Area is hopefully going to allow an ease in transition and will work alongside this project, as opposed to having, or what we frequently find in the oil and gas industry is projects set the trend for or initiate government-to-government discussions. With the African Continental Free Trade Area, we will already have the framework in place to enable projects like this and to transition them. That will allow us to transition them a lot quicker than what we currently are at the moment in terms of getting them to development. So it certainly does provide a good framework to move projects from feasibility and conceptual stage into actual development. As I mentioned earlier, the Kenya and Tanzania gas export pipeline discussions has recently commenced on the continuation of this project, and I believe personally that the African Continental Free Trade Area will allow or facilitate accelerated discussions around the development of that gas export pipeline. Again, the importance of these pipelines and these projects which I mentioned is domestication of the resource, the regional utilization and sharing of the resource, and removing barriers for projects like these to move from feasibility to development, to the development phase.
Yeah, Megan, if you look at that issue you mentioned about FID delays, and you see some exits that international companies, are exiting, especially in the upstream oil and gas sector. Do you think there's sufficient being done? Are the governments doing enough to ensure that they are localizing the skills and the technology so that these projects don't have to stop and stall when these companies exit? And I think that also feeds into a question that has been asked in the chat about whether skills development will be regional with the free movement between countries with AfCFTA. And so you could probably touch on that. And I know, I know Jack will also feed into that as he comes on next. Yeah, so over to you, Megan.
Thank you, Sammy. Certainly, that is one of the goals from an oil company, an upstream oil and gas perspective. It is already incorporated into the fundamentals of these agreements, which are signed with governments. When an international oil company explores for resources in a particular jurisdiction, we rely heavily on European technology. Development of the resource comes through skills and expertise which are not indigenous skills and expertise. So therefore, it rests with government to ensure that these skills and expertise, once oil companies exit, and oil companies exit for a number of reasons. It's not necessarily because of the resource is unproven or can't be proven, or there are a number of business decisions that go into an oil company exit. Focus on a different portfolio, prioritizing of the portfolios. But you're correct, Sammy, we need to make sure then that upon those exits, we are able to continue exploring for the resource in the absence of an international oil company with the skills and expertise. And the way that governments can do that is to ensure that there are partnerships between local oil companies and international oil companies, so that when a international oil company no longer continues on the project, a local oil company has upskilled enough by sitting as a joint venture partner to that local business, knowing enough about the geology of the assets and the what needs to be done next in the project, should an international oil company leave. So local participation in the upstream oil and gas sector is very important from that perspective. And then, of course, through your national oil companies within these jurisdictions, it's important to ensure that data is transferred between these oil companies over to governments. And we see in Namibia, for example, that we have revenue sharing agreements for multi-client seismic survey acquisitions which take place. We have all service providers to the oil and gas industry who shoot the seismic surveys and also license the data on behalf of the national oil company or the government, the custodian of the data. And through that process, skills and technology and training is passed on. For example, you will have two people on the vessel that shoots the seismic data, and then they'll be involved as the national oil company in the processing of the data, and there'll be training, there'll be transfer of software and licensing packages. There are many ways in which to structure this so that you gain as much skills and knowledge transfer as possible from either the service providers in your jurisdiction or the oil companies. And in my experience, most oil companies and service providers are very amenable to making provision for this in their contractual arrangements.
All right. Yeah, thank you very much, Megan. That was a great presentation. So we recovered quite quickly from the shock of the COVID situation, and the prices quickly rebounded. There's a lot of pressure to decarbonize, and companies taking measures to deal with that. And also, the African Continental Free Trade Area presents significant opportunities to have a one-stop shop, to streamline investment. Hopefully, they can implement it properly. You and I can press for proper implementation, and the rest of our attendees as well. The opportunities around refining, perennial opportunities that have, continue to exist and can be taken advantage of. And ultimately, they need to localize skills in this market so that we don't have over-reliance on foreign expertise, and to be able to ensure that we benefit from the resources that exist within this market.
Thank you, Sammy.
Yeah, thank you. So, Jacquel, there was that question about how the free movement of people within the region may enhance skill development, and I'm also cognizant of the fact that we'll be looking at trade and investment, and so how can investors be aware of the opportunities, and most importantly, how do they address the risks? How do they mitigate the risks that these opportunities present?
Thank you, Sammy. So just touching on briefly on what Njeri and Megan has set out in terms of what opportunities, whether it's from a trade perspective, whether it's as an investor, from an investment perspective, there are always risks with those. And if we just go to the first risk in relation to trade within the African or East African region, and we talk about, so for you to particularly sell goods in a region, you need to have good transportation infrastructure. And one of the biggest hurdles that have been identified for the successful implementation of the AfCFTA, or the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, has been investment in infrastructure by the private sector and by national governments. Now, what is recognized is obviously from a government perspective, whether it's in East Africa or the rest of the continent, the governments do not have the physical space to invest in all of these infrastructure needs required from a continental perspective or a regional perspective to make sure that we actually are able to trade effectively and efficiently and cost effectively. So opening up the continent and opening up the region. So if we look at the East Africa region, so what is the links to opportunities? So we talk about investments in roads, we talk about railways, we talk about ports. And if you look at what has happened over the past few years in East Africa, from developing either railways, we know that Tanzania has invested significantly in enhancing the rail capacity. We know that there has been significant investment by Kenya also in the port of Lamu, which is in the north of Kenya, which is a port that was recently opened to assist with the northern link of South Sudan and Ethiopia as a trade route. We know that Bagamoyo, there has been political uncertainty and contentions between the Chinese investors and Tanzania in terms of whether that port development should go ahead or not, and it was suspended, I think, last year, and now there's discussions again. So all of these are critical. So whether it is, and Megan spoke about the pipeline, so the crude oil pipelines or other pipelines within the regions to make sure that you get your oil products to market. So from Mombasa to close to Lake Victoria for Uganda, or the inland waterways that needs to be enhanced in terms of the harbors on those inland waterways to make sure you can access other strategic markets around Lake Victoria. So all of this is, so if there's not investment or sufficient investment to unlock the trade potential, and the trade potential is to ensure, again, efficient and effective trade by traders using infrastructure, whether it's the roads, the railways, the ports, and aviation. So if we look at Ethiopia, we look at Kenya. Ethiopia and Kenya has developed as aviation hubs for the African continent. So how do we capitalize on that further than just having those regions? Would they be Rwanda or Kigali also developing as a center, or do we have different spokes within, not just in the East African region, but on the entire continent, developing aviation hubs? So that is critical. It's a critical risk that has been identified by the World Bank. It is, and also the African Economic Commission of the United Nations, saying we need to ensure that for the effective implementation of the AfCFTA, there needs to be investment in infrastructure or trade-related infrastructure, and there's significant opportunities for private sector participants in investing in trade-related infrastructure, because without that, you don't have an effective AfCFTA, you don't have integration, and the laudable objectives under the AfCFTA cannot be ultimately met. Now, let's look at, so when we talk about the infrastructure, we talk about investment. When we talk about investment, we mean that there's capital flow from one region to another region, and when there's capital flow, there's the various considerations that an investor would take into account to say, do I invest in Kenya? Do I invest in Somalia? Do I invest in Rwanda for purposes of either a concession for a road or concession for a port, the Bagamoyo port? What are the considerations that an investor would then take into account in ultimately ensuring that we open up trade in the East Africa region and broadly the African continent? So next slide, Rika. So when we talk about the risk, and obviously the first risk that comes to mind, which is a global risk and has affected not just the East African region, it has affected the entire continent, the entire world. It's obviously COVID-19, in terms of also actually identifying for the East Africa region and the continent that there are certain sectors which require further investment. So Africa needs to make sure that certain downstream industries are developed to make sure that we can manufacture either our own vaccines, we can manufacture our own PPE equipment, because that has been a significant risk that was identified also in various reports, saying that Africa has to now wait until, and this is what has happened last year, wait until other countries get their PPEs for us to ultimately benefit from that, or get it at a significant cost. So COVID-19 and its effects still going forward on the region and informal trade specifically. Then if you look at the region broadly speaking, obviously each country has its own independent sovereign states in East Africa, but each country has its own unique risk. And depending on which country you decide to invest in, it will ultimately be linked to another country. So any landlocked country that does not have access to a port by default for the trade of goods, whether it's Uganda, whether it's Rwanda or Burundi, would need to take, so any investor investing in those landlocked countries will have to take into account what happens in Kenya, what happens in Tanzania. So it's not just investing in Rwanda, but it's looking at the entire value chain. I want to manufacture batteries for EVs in Kampala, but I need to transport, again, linked to the transport infrastructure, I need to transport that either through Tanzania or Kenya. What is the most efficient way of transporting? So those are the political risks that you would need to take into account, regionally speaking, and depending on the country. Corruption is usually ultimately a risk in any jurisdiction, and there are countries that stands out in terms of the corruption index or perception of corruption, and those are factors largely taking into account. Climate change is also one factor that investors would take into account depending on what sector you would invest. So if it's agriculture, climate change will definitely be a factor that you take into account, or the investment in major infrastructures like dams. Terrorism and piracy, being at the Horn of Africa, you have Somalia and Kenya also being close and sometimes being targeted by Al-Shabaab. Those are factors you take into account. So there's a new port that has been developed by Kenya at Lomau, close to the northern border of Somalia. So would investors be inclined to invest in that port or in the industrial area that is contemplated and the exclusive economic zone in that region? So we expect civil unrest. So civil unrest either because of elections, as we've seen in Tanzania. We've seen that in South Africa also in the recent past week. So these are major factors of any investor would typically take into account, but it's not the exclusive factors that decides whether I do make the investment decisions, because most investments, as we know, are made in highly risky jurisdictions. And then the question is, how do you mitigate against that risk? So just the next slide, when we talk about country risk specifically and what typically you would find from an international investment law perspective. So what would investors look at? And why would you want to mitigate against it? So when we talk about major projects, so infrastructure projects, or let's take the pipeline project between Uganda and Tanzania. So there's obviously significant capital investment by Total and a number of other entities in the project. So when you look at an investment decision of that nature, see, there are certain things, and one of the fundamental issues that stands out for any investment is expropriation or nationalization of your investment. So how do you mitigate against expropriation? So these are or the fact that you have been granted a concession or license. There's either when the license comes up for renewal, the government decides not to renew your license or deny the renewal. And this is the nature of political risk or country risk, as you would call it, is when an investor decides to invest in a particular jurisdiction, it usually has the bargain. So the investor has the money and the country has the oil resource or the mineral resource, and you can negotiate and you can bargain and say, I want tax concessions, I want incentives, and you want all of these things that you would want to make sure that your investment is efficient and you can ensure your shareholders get maximum value. But the nature of major infrastructure projects is that once you have sunk the well or sunk the mine shaft and you spend your $1 billion or $2 billion on the infrastructure, your investment cost, as we would call it, is sunk. So it's there. You can't decide tomorrow, I'm going to take my pipeline, I'm going to move it to Kenya. It's there. It's a physical infrastructure. You spend $3 billion on it. It's there. So how do I mitigate against the political risk of once the investment cost is sunk, then the bargaining changes. So the bargaining shifts from the investor to the government. So when there's a new party that comes to power in that particular country, how do you mitigate against that political risk? So 10 years from now, you concluded the agreement with government X. Now there's a new government saying, but when that government negotiated the contract with you, it was not done for the benefit of the people. There was no social benefits. They're not paying taxes, and we see this in so many countries on the continent, whether it's, and I've made an example of, so there's the Windsor gold arbitration. So this is arbitration that has been initiated by a Canadian company against Tanzania in relation to an alleged, and I call it an alleged expropriation of resources, a retention license for gold, where the government decided you've held on too long to this license, and I'm going to ultimately revoke it, and I'm going to grant it to someone else. But these are the typical type of risk that you have as investors. So increase of taxes. I change my requirement in terms of ownership or participation. I require, so today you can only mine the mineral and export it. Tomorrow the new government says no, but you can't just export it. You have to refine your gold in Tanzania. So how do you mitigate against those type of risks? Because these are real risks. So enforced renegotiation of contracts. So this we've also seen a number of African jurisdictions, and again in Tanzania, where in the natural resources sector, there was a piece of legislation that was passed a few years ago where the government, some contracts, an arbitration clause in Tanzania, if it's in a natural resources contract, is seen as unconscionable. And the government, which they are doing now, can renegotiate certain terms and conditions that are in your joint operating agreement or your mine development agreement. How do you mitigate against that risk? What do you ensure is in your contract, where in this case, again, from a Tanzanian perspective, they would say, yes, we concluded the contract, but that we've passed the law, it's unconscionable, so we're not bound to it. And that brings us to risk mitigation. If we can just go to the next slide. So how do you mitigate risk? And so the first item I have on there, both Jerry has mentioned it and Megan is also, so the importance of a due diligence. Firstly, you need to know your country, you need to know your sector, you need to understand what is all the pitfalls in that particular jurisdiction relating to your sector. So you can't anticipate what will happen 10 years down the line in terms of a new government or new party coming to power and wanting to change your contract. Now, what do you do in that circumstances? So what we would call in international investment law is investment structuring. And to a large extent, maybe the AfCFTA would make it easier for intra-Africa investment, because we have an instrument called which is still under negotiation. So it's the Protocol on Investment. So the intention with that is all of those things that I've just mentioned in the initial slide, you typically get in a bilateral investment treaty or multilateral investment treaty that has an investment element to it. So where a state or government gives a guarantee to another government to say that if your investor comes and invests in my country, then I will not that I will not expropriate him. If I expropriate him and I comply with the requirements for a lawful expropriation, I will compensate him for it. Because expropriation in international law, it's a custom, it's every state has the sovereign right to expropriate someone for a public purpose or a public intention. Now, if you comply with that requirement, you can expropriate. So that's an international law principle. But at least you have the guarantee that you will not be expropriated without compensation. You have the guarantee, in addition to that, what you typically will get is you have the guarantee to be treated fairly and equitably. It's a very controversial standard, and there's lots of issues and disputes that have been raised in terms of a standard that is, to some extent, creates unintended consequences for states. But you typically get a guarantee to be treated fairly and equitably. You get what we call most favored nation principles, which is you should be treated the same as another investor in another jurisdiction, which is not from the same country, and you have a guarantee against for the free transfer of capital or funds. So you would typically, so from an investment structuring perspective, to mitigate against those risks, you would look at bilateral investment treaties within the region. Is there any treaties? Which treaties are there? And do they provide you with sufficient protection? So if I structure my investment to Kenya or to Rwanda, through Tanzania, and my investment flow is actually from, say, Rwanda to Tanzania, does it provide me with sufficient protection from Rwanda to Tanzania, because Rwanda might have an agreement with Tanzania in relation to investment protection for its entity. Also looking at investment laws. So typically investment laws could also provide certain guarantees for companies in relation to how to structure your investment, and also the investment guarantees you would typically get under international agreements. So the other element to it, so that's investment structuring, and there must be a distinction between investment structuring and investment shopping. So investment shopping is essentially, if I already have an investment in the country, I have constructed a major port, and the port has been there for many, many years, and then I get wind of the government wanting to do certain things. So maybe they want to expropriate you or whatever the case is. And then you decide you want to restructure your entire investment. So the corporate entity vehicle that holds this shareholding or holds this entity to a different jurisdiction, say Mauritius, because it provides more beneficial protections for your investment. That will probably be frowned against, and you would not be able to rely on that in investment dispute. So the importance of this, and maybe the point that I need to get to, is what do you want to, so you can have the guarantees against either not being expropriated or being treated fairly, is you want to be able to sue the government if that eventuality ultimately happens. And you want to sue the government not in their own host, in the state where you have the investment, but in an international tribunal. So you would want to make sure that you have either a reference to an international arbitration under exit or under the UNICEF provisions. Now, the other way of doing investment structuring would be an investment agreement. So that's a typical, you would get any agreement which you conclude with the government in relation to a particular investment. Say it's an energy project, you have an implementation agreement. In that agreement, you have all the standards, but importantly, you have reference to, say, exit, which is the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, or the resolution of that dispute. You also typically have stabilization provisions in these agreements, but again, even though you might have stabilization provisions in there that provides guarantees, if you don't have a properly drafted arbitration clause that provides you with protection either in a international arbitration, not an exit arbitration, or exit arbitration, which is probably the most preferred one, then your clause doesn't really mean much. It means you're still subject to the domestic courts of that particular jurisdiction. The other measure is political risk insurance. So you can actually take political risk insurance for any of these things through MEGA, which is the multilateral guarantee agency of the World Bank that provides for insurances of these type of political risk. I've spoken about international arbitration clauses, exit. We can probably have a whole discussion and lecture about exit and how it works, but for purposes of the current webinar, I've just broadly covered those. So that is typically the risk mitigation measures that you would get, just on a very condensed basis. I've discussed it. The next slide, because we are running out of time, is just briefly and quickly talking about Rwanda. So if you look at Rwanda as a country, and also from where they've come since 1994, it is economic miracle, and they are just progressing even further in terms of what they are doing, from ensuring that Rwanda is one of the gems in East Africa, from either an investment structuring perspective, a country where the ease of doing business is being capitalized and policies are being put in place to make sure that any investor that decides to invest in Rwanda gets incentives and can also use Rwanda as a base for investment, not just in the East Africa region, but with the AfCFTA being a base for investment in the entire Central African region or continentally, because there is a new investment code. It was also passed by Rwanda a few months ago. I think it came into effect in February this year, which streamlines incentives and structuring for entities in Rwanda to capitalize on the East Africa region. One of the biggest risks for Rwanda is, it goes back to my first slide about trade. So being a landlocked country, you are dependent on the other countries who have access to a port to ensure that your product ultimately gets to the market. And their initiatives and investments in developing an infrastructure hub is to some extent curtailed by the fact that they are reliant on the other two big players, which is Tanzania and Kenya within the region. So if you don't deal with the trade-related infrastructure bottlenecks, it also affects any investment in the manufacturing sector in Rwanda. Thank you, Sammy.
Yeah, thank you, Jackwell. That was a great presentation. I think, East Africa, like the rest of Africa, presents a lot of opportunities for investment. There's a huge gap in infrastructure among many other areas. You've identified quite a number of risk areas, but listening to them, COVID-19, political issues, civil unrest, it sounds like any other country in the world today. And I think these problems are no longer peculiar to this side of the world, and they have been confronted by investors globally. And therefore, I find that it presents opportunities for those investors to appreciate that this market is sufficiently stable for investment. The other thing you mentioned is how to mitigate that risk, about having multilateral treaties, bilateral treaties, investment agreements that offer different opportunities for recourse should the investment go bad. And I think that's where Desmond, dovetails nicely. Desmond, with the expertise in dispute resolution, it's like having Kevlar when you're going to a gunfight. So we'd want to hear from you. What are the avenues that investors would have to resolve disputes in the event that they can't amicably settle them? Are there any opportunities regionally to resolve disputes, or must we always go to ICSID? So over to you, Desmond.
Yeah, thanks, Sami. I think the overview you've given is a good one. Yeah, so commercial dispute resolution is an important factor to consider for an investor, even as part of your due diligence when you're considering whether to make an investment in East Africa. Just to be aware, what are the available options for dispute resolution, and how to manage it really as part of your risk mitigation. So we'll just have a look at past. Maybe I'll just give you an overview of how we will look at it. So I'll first look at the methods of commercial dispute resolution that are common in East Africa, and then we shall look at we shall just have an overview of commercial arbitration in East Africa. It's a pretty wide topic, but we will just pick out some salient features, and then just some practical tips at the end, which you can take away. So the methods of commercial dispute resolutions that are common in East Africa is first through the national courts. And when we say the national courts, this is obviously through litigation. So foreign investors who are engaged in an international commercial transaction with a party in East Africa have the freedom to resolve or seek resolution of their dispute to the national courts. There'll probably just be a few factors to bear in mind, and one of them is whether the contract was concluded in the East African nation, and when we talk about whether the contract was concluded, we are really looking at whether the contract was performed in East Africa. So that one is usually a box that is easily checked, especially if you have a physical investment in the country. Where it is a point of litigation or dispute, it's in the sense of trade in goods, and the question now becomes, where were the goods actually delivered in the country, or where was the contract signed? So the reason why a foreign investor would want to use the national courts to resolve their disputes, one is because the other contracting party, who we would call the defendant, has its assets located in that particular jurisdiction. So in the event that you get a favorable judgment, then it is easier to enforce it and enforce it through attaching those assets. So that's one obvious advantage of approaching the national courts. Then the national courts, it varies with jurisdictions. Jurisdictions like Kenya are quite robust. So you are probably going to, be before a judge or a magistrate who is well aware of commercial principles, and you would probably have a forum before a judge who understands the need or the need to have certainty in his or her decisions. The challenges, though, with litigation through the national courts is because of the court diary. They are limited a few courts that are present, and commercial courts for that matter. We only have a few judges, so we have a few judges who have to hear and determine hundreds of cases. So obviously that stretches their capacity to be able to, speedily resolve the commercial dispute. So that's a challenge. The other method of commercial dispute resolution is mediation. And mediation, it's simply an alternative dispute resolution mechanism where you have a third party who assists, the contracting parties who are in dispute to reach an amicable settlement. So he merely facilitates the parties to negotiate and reach a settlement. And the common modes of mediation in East Africa is, there are three of them. The first one is a court-annexed mediation. In Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, and Tanzania, you have this mode of mediation where when a party files a commercial dispute in the High Court, the case goes through a screening before a registrar just to determine whether it is suitable for mediation. And if it is found that it is suitable for mediation, the parties are compelled to attempt mediation as a way of resolving their dispute before it can be passed on to a judge to hear and determine the matter. The parties during the mediation process, it is not, of course, mandatory for the parties to actually reach a settlement, but it is mandatory for them to at least go for the mediation, and there are penal consequences for failing to cooperate during the mediation process, such as costs being meted out to the non-cooperative party. The advantages of this, which is a unique model in East Africa, is that it has really helped the judiciary reduce the backlog of cases, because you find that when parties have a chance at least to try and negotiate their disputes with the assistance of a third party, then in most cases they would take that option instead of a full-blown litigation. So they have been very positive results in this part of the region. The other method of mediation is, of course, through a mediation agreement. If you have a mediation clause that actually provides the instances when a mediation would be triggered, and this would normally be supervised by an institution, an arbitral institution or a mediation institution, and they would supervise us to the choice of mediators and so forth. And then there's the ad hoc mediation, where you do not have a mediation clause, but you opt to choose a mediator to just help you resolve the disputes. The advantage of mediation as a method of dispute resolution is, of course, it preserves the commercial relationship between the parties. As opposed to litigation, where you have a win-lose situation. In mediation, you are likely to have a win-win situation. And then arbitration, which would be the focus really of my presentation. So this is also an alternative method of dispute resolution. And for international commercial transactions, it's a popular and a preferred method of dispute resolution. It might soon be eclipsed by mediation, which is our hope, but so far arbitration seems to be the most preferred method of dispute resolution. And the reason for this really is because of the speed, first and foremost, because as compared to the national courts, you are not queuing with everyone else waiting for your turn to be heard. So you are likely to have your dispute resolved much quicker. And then also there's the flexibility. With commercial arbitration, you have the option to, you have the flexibility to choose who would be the person that would hear and determine your dispute. So you can agree in your arbitration clause or agreement that the number of years you want your arbitrator to have been qualified, or the kind of qualifications that person should have, and somebody who both parties believe has both the capacity and the integrity to determine the dispute. So that's a very big advantage. And then of course there's the choice of governing law, because if you take into account where there are investors involved, of course they do want to choose a law that has some certainty with it, or maybe a law that they're familiar with, or a law that is progressive, or that has principles that are in uniform or comply with the international standards of resolving disputes. So you are free to choose the governing law. So that's one of the reasons why it's a preferred method of dispute resolution. So I'll just go next into looking at just an overview of commercial arbitration. It's a wide topic, but just an overview of how it is in East Africa at the moment. So as Sami mentioned, when you're looking at in investment disputes, historically investment disputes, the places for resolution of investment disputes has been ICSID, but we as a region, we are developing our capacity to be able to resolve disputes that have an international law component, or where you have parties who have where you have an investor or somebody, one of the parties is from a foreign jurisdiction. So we are developing our capacity to be able to hear and determine those such kinds of disputes. And Nairobi is one of those places. And as a seat of arbitration, it is becoming attractive as one, as opposed, or as an alternative to ICSID. Because really of the legislative support for arbitration. So the Arbitration Act of 1995 of Kenya is modeled according to the ancestral model law, which is a standard international standard best practice for arbitration, and provides mechanisms for resolution of in international commercial disputes. So that's one of the things that is making Nairobi as an attractive place for resolution of disputes. And then the judiciary's attitude to arbitration agreements is one which is progressive. So they do, whenever a party brings to the attention of the court that there's an arbitration agreement, they are very ready to assist in that arbitration and assist in the process of arbitration, not to interfere with it, but just in a limited way. For instance, to give just an interim order as the parties now proceed to have their dispute determined before the arbitrator. And then also in terms of recognizing awards that have been made by the arbitral tribunal, our courts do recognize those awards, and this is mainly because the legislative environment has also enabled that. So as Kenya, we have acceded to the New York Convention, which basically means that there is a reciprocity between our country and signatory states, such that any foreign awards would be enforced by our local courts. And the other reason why Nairobi would become an attractive place for resolution of commercial arbitration is we also have the Nairobi Center for International Arbitration, which is an institution, just similar to ICSID, which has built-in mechanisms for the supervision and for the supervision of arbitrations. And it is, the way it has been set up, with similar standards for other international institutions. So we will look at Kigali. Kigali is also a preferred seat of arbitration. Similar to Kenya, it has adopted the ancestral model law for its arbitration, and so it's of similar international standard. We also find that the judiciary's attitude towards arbitration agreements and enforcement of foreign arbitral awards is also progressive, similar to that of Kenya, because they're also signatories to the New York Convention. So parties really, can be able to resolve their disputes, in either Kigali or Rwanda. In East Africa, they are the ones that are the most progressive. Not to say that the others do not have arbitral institutions, but they are the most progressive in East Africa. So the arbitral institution, the main arbitral institution in Rwanda is the Kigali Center for International Arbitration. And one unique thing about the Kigali Center is that you find that in their panel of arbitrators, you have they have opened their panel to other countries in the region, and also to the world. So you would find that in that panel you'd find an arbitrator from South Africa, from Uganda, from Kenya, or from England. So it really gives that international outlook. Yeah. Then generally in East Africa, other countries are also catching up. So Tanzania, for a long time, did not have a modern arbitration law, but as of 2020, they came up with an Arbitration Act, which provides for international arbitration. And that act also provides a center. It also established the Tanzania Center for Arbitration. So it's catching up, and there's a push towards harmonization of the arbitral laws within the region, just to be able to encourage investors, to invest in East Africa, knowing that if a dispute ever arises, that the standards of resolving that disputes is of international standards. In Tanzania, do parties have a choice on the governing law? In most cases, yes. The exception is in the case of where there's a dispute that arises out of the natural wealth and resources. So a dispute arising out of extraction or exploitation or acquisition of natural wealth and resources, such as oil and gas. In such particular cases, the governing law would be the laws of Tanzania, notwithstanding the fact that the parties have chosen a different law. And also the institution that would determine that dispute has to be an institution in Tanzania. So that's the difference with Tanzania. Ethiopia, they have adopted the New York Convention. So just to go back for Tanzania, I think the saving grace is that now that they've established a Tanzania Center for Arbitration, so for disputes that relating to extraction of natural resources, at least you have the option of the Tanzania Center for Arbitration as a forum for resolving your dispute. Ethiopia has also adopted the New York Convention for enforcement of foreign awards. So in Ethiopia, just similar to Kenya, Tanzania, and the other countries for East Africa, their national courts would be able to recognize and enforce an arbitral award, an international arbitral award. Yes. So in terms of maybe practical tips, just as a conclusion for investors, it's one thing to be aware of the methods of dispute resolution, but how can you really take advantage of this dispute resolution? The first point is just when you're drafting your agreements, really to make sure that you have an arbitration clause and also a mediation clause. And when you look at mediation clauses, in as much as these countries in East Africa have a mandatory, have a court annexed mediation, which is really a court supervised mediation, you would also want to have. It is best to have how to choose how you'd want your mediation conducted, and to choose the institution that you'd want to supervise your mediation, and the instances when a mediation would be triggered. And then also, of course, for the arbitration, it is best to have an arbitration clause, so that from the onset you are able to determine what kind of disputes would go for arbitration, who would be your arbitrator, in terms of the capacity. You want to have that at the very outset so as to mitigate your risk. And then the other practical tip is it is also advisable in your arbitration agreements to choose the institution that would manage your arbitration, what we'd call institutional arbitration, rather than leave it to that time when a dispute arises, to now start trying and looking for an institution or that would manage the dispute. It's important to have this determined at the contracting stage. And the reason you want to have an institutional arbitration is so that you have an independent body being able to pre-select or have qualified arbitrators and mediators as part of their panel that you can choose from, and who would also provide that kind of support during the mediation process, because of the rules that they already have when you know the rules that they have. So for instance, the Nairobi International Center of Arbitration have their rules, and you're able to look at those rules at the contracting stage to see whether those rules are of international standard, whether they provide predictability, and whether they would be favorable to your case in the event of a dispute. And then the other thing to consider is the choice of governing law, where you're looking at choice of governing law or a seat of arbitration. So you want to consider, what would you want to be your, the law that governs your contract. Is it Kenya, or is it Rwanda, or is it South Africa? And those are things that you'd want to really consider at the contracting stage. And the choice of governing law, of course, is you'd want one that is progressive, just like Kenya and Rwanda. Thank you, Sami.
Fantastic. Thank you, Desmond, and apologies to our attendees. We've run over about 10 minutes, but we really, really are delighted that you made time to be with us and to attend. The slides will be shared in due course, but thank you to the panelists, and thank you most of all to the attendees. We're delighted that you're with us on the webinar on the Spotlight on East Africa. Happy investing, and we are looking forward to engaging further with you. Have a good evening, everybody. Thank you.